During the American Civil War, the Union referred to the United States of America and specifically to the national government and the 23 free states and 5 border states that supported it. The Union was opposed by 11 southern slave states that formed the Confederate States, or the Confederacy. All of the Union states provided soldiers for the U.S. Army. The border areas also sent large numbers of soldiers to the Confederacy. The border states played a major role as a supply base for the Union invasion of the Confederacy. The Northeast provided the industrial resources for a mechanized war, producing large quantities of munitions and supplies, as well as financing for the war. The Midwest provided soldiers, food, horses, financial support, and training camps. Army hospitals were set up across the Union. Most states had Republican governors who energetically supported the war effort and suppressed anti-war subversion in 1863–64. The Democratic Party strongly supported the war in 1861, but in 1862 was split between the war Democrats and the anti-war element led by the Copperheads. The Democrats made major electoral gains in 1862 in state elections, most notably in New York. They lost ground in 1863, especially in Ohio. In 1864 the Republicans campaigned under the National Union Party banner, which attracted many war Democrats and soldiers and scored a landslide victory for Lincoln and his entire ticket. The war years were quite prosperous except where serious fighting and guerrilla warfare took place along the southern border. Prosperity was stimulated by heavy government spending and the creation of an entirely new national banking system. The Union states invested a great deal of money and effort in organizing psychological and social support for soldiers' wives, widows, orphans, and from the soldiers themselves. Most soldiers were volunteers, although after 1862 many volunteered to escape the draft and to take advantage of generous cash bounties on offer from states and localities. Draft resistance was notable in some larger cities, especially New York City with its massive anti-draft riots of 1863 and in some remote districts such as the coal mining areas of Pennsylvania. Etymology. The Union is sometimes referred to as the North, both then and now, as opposed to the Confederacy, which was the South. The Union never recognized the legitimacy of the Confederacy's secession and maintained at all times that it remained entirely a part of the United States of America. In foreign affairs, the Union was the only side recognized by all other nations, none of which officially recognized the Confederate government. The term Union originated in the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. The Constitution of 1787 was issued and ratified in the name not of the states but of "we the people of the United States." In order to form a more perfect union, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Even before the war started, the phrase "preserve the Union" was commonplace, and a Union of States had been used to refer to the entire United States of America. Using the term Union to apply to the non-secessionist side carried a connotation of legitimacy as a continuation of the pre-existing political entity. Confederates saw the U.S. as being opposed to slavery and occasionally referred to them as abolitionists, as in reference to the U.S. Navy as the Abolition Fleet, and the U.S. Army as the Abolition Forces. Size and strength. In comparison to the Confederacy, the Union had a large industrialized and urbanized area, and more advanced commercial, transportation and financial systems than the rural South. Additionally, the Union states had a manpower advantage of 5-2 at the start of the war. Year by year, the Confederacy shrank and lost control of increasing quantities of resources and population. Meanwhile, the Union turned its growing potential advantage into a much stronger military force. However, much of the Union's strength had to be used to garrison conquered areas, and to protect railroads and other vital points. The Union's great advantages in population and industry would prove to be vital long-term factors in its victory over the Confederacy. But it took the Union a long while to fully mobilize these resources. Public opinion. The attack on Fort Sumter rallied the North to the defense of American nationalism. Historian Alan Evans says, "The thunderclap of Sumter produced a startling crystallization of Northern sentiment. Anger swept the land. From every side came news of mass meetings, speeches, resolutions, tenders of business support, the muster of companies and regiments, the determined action of governors and legislatures." McClintock states, "At the time, Northerners were right to wonder at the near unanimity that so quickly followed long months of bitterness and discord. It would not last throughout the protracted war to come, or even through the year, but in that moment of unity was laid bare the common Northern nationalism usually hidden by the fierce battles more typical of the political arena." Historian Michael Smith argues that, as the war ground on year after year, the spirit of American republicanism grew stronger and generated fears of corruption in high places. Voters became afraid of power being centralized in Washington, extravagant spending, and war profiteering. Democratic candidates emphasized these fears. The candidates added that rapid modernization was putting too much political power in the hands of Eastern financiers and industrialists. They warned that the abolition of slavery would bring a flood of freed blacks into the labor market of the North. Republicans responded with claims of defeatism. They indicted Copperheads for criminal conspiracies to free Confederate prisoners of war, and played on the spirit of nationalism and the growing hatred of the slave owners as the guilty party in the war. President Lincoln. Historians have overwhelmingly praised the political genius of Abraham Lincoln's performance as president. His first priority was military victory. This required that he master entirely new skills as a strategist and diplomat. He oversaw supplies, finances, manpower, the selection of generals, and the course of overall strategy. Working closely with state and local politicians, he rallied public opinion and articulated a national mission that has defined America ever since. Lincoln's charm and willingness to cooperate with political and personal enemies made Washington work much more smoothly than Richmond, the Confederate capital, and his wit smoothed many rough edges. Lincoln's cabinet proved much stronger and more efficient than Davis's, as Lincoln channeled personal rivalries into a competition for excellence rather than mutual destruction. With William Seward at State, Salmon P. Chase at the Treasury, and Edwin Stanton at the War Department, Lincoln had a powerful cabinet of determined men. Except for monitoring major appointments and decisions, Lincoln gave them free rein to destroy the Confederacy. Congress. The Republican Congress passed many major laws that reshaped the nation's economy, financial system, tax system, land system, and higher education system. These included the Morrill Tariff, the Homestead Act, the Pacific Railroad Act, and the National Banking Act. Lincoln paid relatively little attention to this legislation as he focused on war issues, but he worked smoothly with powerful congressional leaders, such as Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, Lyman Trumbull, Justin Smith Morrill, and William Pitt Fessenden. Military and Reconstruction issues were another matter. Lincoln, as the leader of the moderate and conservative factions of the Republican Party, often crossed swords with the radical Republicans, led by Stevens and Sumner. Author Bruce Tapp shows that Congress challenged Lincoln's role as commander-in-chief through the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. It was a joint committee of both houses that was dominated by the radical Republicans, who took a hard line against the Confederacy. During the 37th and 38th Congresses, the committee investigated every aspect of Union military operations, with special attention to finding commanders culpable for military defeats. It assumed an inevitable Union victory. Failure was perceived to indicate evil motivations of personal failures. The committee distrusted graduates of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, since many of the Academy's alumni were leaders of the enemy army. Members of the committee much preferred political generals with a satisfactory political record. Some of the committee suggested that West Pointers who engaged in strategic maneuver were cowardly or even disloyal. It ended up endorsing incompetent but politically correct generals. The opposition came from Copperhead Democrats, who were strongest in the Midwest and wanted to allow Confederate secession. In the East, opposition to the war was strongest among Irish Catholics, but also included business interests connected to the South typified by August Belmont. The Democratic Party was deeply split. In 1861 most Democrats supported the war. However, the party increasingly split down the middle between the moderates who supported the war effort and the peace element, including Copperheads, who did not. It scored major gains in the 1862 elections, and elected the moderate Horatio Seymour as governor of New York. They gained 28 seats in the House of Representatives, but Republicans retained control of both the House and the Senate. The 1862 election for the Indiana legislature was especially hard-fought. Though the Democrats gained control of the legislature, they were unable to impede the war effort. Republican Governor Oliver P. Morton was able to maintain control of the state's contribution to the war effort despite the Democrat majority. Washington was especially helpful in 1864 in arranging furloughs to allow Hoosier soldiers to return home so they could vote in elections. Across the North in 1864, the great majority of soldiers voted Republican. Men who had been Democrats before the war often abstained voted Republican. As the federal draft laws tightened, there was serious unrest among Copperhead's strongholds, such as the Irish in the Pennsylvania coal mining districts. The government needed the coal more than the draftees, so it ignored the largely non-violent draft dodging there. The violent New York City draft riots of 1863 were suppressed by the U.S.Army firing grape shot down cobblestone city streets. The Democrats nominated George McClellan, a war Democrat, for the 1864 presidential election but gave him an anti-war platform. In terms of Congress, the opposition against the war was nearly powerless, as was the case in most states. In Indiana and Illinois, pro-war governors circumvented anti-war legislatures elected in 1862. For 30 years after the war, the Democrats carried the burden of having opposed the martyred Lincoln, the salvation of the Union and a destroyer of slavery. The Copperheads were a large faction of Northern Democrats who opposed the war, demanding an immediate peace settlement. They said they wanted to restore the Union as it was, but they realized that the Confederacy would never voluntarily rejoin the U.S. The most prominent Copperhead was Ohio's Clement L. Valentine, a congressman and leader of the Democratic Party in Ohio. He was defeated in an intense election for governor in 1863. Republican prosecutors in the Midwest accused some Copperhead activists of treason in a series of trials in 1864. Copperheadism was a grassroots movement, strongest in the area just north of the Ohio River, as well as some urban ethnic wards. Some historians have argued that it represented a traditionalistic element alarmed at the rapid modernization of society sponsored by the Republican Party. It looked back to Jacksonian democracy for inspiration, with ideals that promoted an agrarian rather than industrialized concept of society. Weber argues that the Copperheads damaged the Union war effort by fighting the draft, encouraging desertion, and forming conspiracies. However, other historians say the Copperheads were a legitimate opposition force unfairly treated by the government, adding that the draft was in disrepute and that the Republicans greatly exaggerated the conspiracies for partisan reasons. Copperheadism was a major issue in the 1864 presidential election. Its strength waxed when Union armies were doing poorly and waned when they won great victories. After the fall of Atlanta in September 1864, military success seemed assured and Copperheadism collapsed. Soldiers, recruiting volunteers, enthusiastic young men clamored to join the Union Army in 1861. They came with family support for reasons of patriotism and excitement. Washington decided to keep the small regular army intact. It only had 16,000 men and was needed to guard the frontier. Its officers could, however, join the temporary new volunteer army that was formed, with expectations that their experience would lead to rapid promotions. The problem with volunteering, however, was its serious lack of planning, leadership, and organization at the highest levels. Washington called on the states for troops, and every northern governor set about raising and equipping regiments, and sent the bills to the War Department. The men could elect the junior officers while the governor appointed the senior officers, and Lincoln appointed the generals. Typically, politicians used the local organizations to raise troops and were in line to become colonel. The problem was that the War Department, under the disorganized leadership of Simon Cameron, also authorized local and private groups to raise regiments. The result was widespread confusion and delay. Pennsylvania, for example, had acute problems. When Washington called for 10 more regiments, enough men volunteered to form 30. However, they were scattered among 70 different new units, none of them a complete regiment. Not until Washington approved gubernatorial control of all new units was the problem resolved. Allen Nevins is particularly scathing of this in his analysis. A president more exact, systematic and vigilant than Lincoln, a secretary more alert and clear-headed than Cameron, would have prevented these difficulties. By the end of 1861, 700,000 soldiers were drilling in Union camps. The first wave in spring was called up for only 90 days, then the soldiers went home or re-enlisted. Later waves enlisted for 3 years. The new recruits spent the time drilling in company and regiment formations. The combat in the first year, though strategically important, involved relatively small forces and few casualties. Sickness was a much more serious cause of hospitalization and death. In the first few months, men wore low-quality uniforms made of shoddy material, but by fall, sturdy wool uniforms in blue were standard. The nation's factories were converted to produce the rifles, cannon, wagons, tents, telegraph sets, and the myriad of other special items the Army needed. While business had been slow or depressed in spring 1861, because of warfares and Southern boycotts, by fall business was hiring again, offering young men jobs that were an alternative way to help win the war. Non-partisanship was the rule in the first year, but by summer 1862, many Democrats had stopped supporting the war effort, and volunteering fell off sharply in the strongholds. The calls for more and more soldiers continued, so states and localities responded by offering cash bonuses. By 1863, a draft law was in effect, but few men actually were drafted and served. Since the law was designed to get them to volunteer or hire a substitute, others had away or left the country. with the Emancipation Proclamation taking effect in January 1863. Localities could meet the draft quota by sponsoring regiments of ex-slaves organized in the South. Michigan was especially eager to send thousands of volunteers. A study of the cities of Grand Rapids and Niles shows an overwhelming surge of nationalism in 1861, whipping up enthusiasm for the war in all segments of society, and all political, religious, ethnic, and occupational groups. However, by 1862 the casualties were mounting, and the war was increasingly focused on freeing the slaves in addition to preserving the Union. Copperhead Democrats called the war a failure, and it became an increasingly partisan Republican effort. Michigan voters remained evenly split between the parties in the presidential election of 1864. Motivations of soldiers. Perman says historians are of two minds on why millions of men seemed so eager to fight, suffer, and die over 4 years. Some historians emphasize that Civil War soldiers were driven by political ideology, holding firm beliefs about the importance of liberty, union, or state rights, or about the need to protect or to destroy slavery. Others point to less overtly political reasons to fight, such as the defense of one's home and family, or the honor and brotherhood to be preserved when fighting alongside other men. Most historians agree that, no matter what he thought about when he went into the war, the experience of combat affected him profoundly and sometimes affected his reasons for continuing to fight. The Paperwork War. On the whole, the national, state, and local governments handled the avalanche of paperwork effectively. Skills developed in insurance and financial companies formed the basis of systematic forms, copies, summaries, and filing systems used to make sense of masses of human data. The leader in this effort, John Shaw Billings, later developed a system of mechanically storing, sorting, and counting numerical information using punch cards. Nevertheless, old-fashioned methodology had to be recognized and overcome. An illustrative case study came in New Hampshire, where the critical post of State Adjutant General was held in 1861–64 by elderly politician Anthony C. Colby and his son Daniel E. Colby. They were patriotic, but were overwhelmed with the complexity of their duties. The state lost track of men who enlisted after 1861. It had no personnel records or information on volunteers, substitutes, or draftees, and there was no inventory of weaponry and supplies. Nathaniel Head took over in 1864, obtained an adequate budget and office staff, and reconstructed the missing paperwork. As a result, widows, orphans, and disabled veterans received the post-war payments they had earned. Medical conditions. More soldiers died of disease than from battle injuries, and even larger numbers were temporarily incapacitated by wounds, disease, and accidents. The Union responded by building army hospitals in every state. The hygiene of the camps was poor, especially at the beginning of the war when men who had seldom been far from home were brought together for training with thousands of strangers. First came epidemics of the childhood diseases of chickenpox, mumps, whooping cough, and especially measles. Operations in the South meant a dangerous and new disease environment, bringing diarrhea, dysentery, typhoid fever, and malaria. There were no antibiotics, so the surgeons prescribed coffee, whiskey, and quinine. Harsh weather, bad water, inadequate shelter in winter quarters, poor policing of camps, and dirty camp hospitals took the toll. This was a common scenario in wars from time immemorial, and conditions faced by the Confederate Army were even worse. What was different in the Union was the emergence of skilled, well-funded medical organizers who took proactive action, especially in the much enlarged United States Army Medical Department, and the United States Sanitary Commission, a new private agency. Numerous other new agencies policies also targeted the medical and morale needs of soldiers, including the United States Christian Commission, as well as smaller private agencies, such as the Women's Central Association of Relief for Sick and Wounded in the Army, founded in 1861 by Henry Whitney Bellows, a Unitarian minister, and social reformer Dorothea Dix. Systematic funding appeals raised public consciousness, as well as millions of dollars. Many thousands of volunteers worked in the hospitals and rest homes, most famously poet Walt Whitman. Frederick Law Olmsted, a famous landscape architect, was the highly efficient executive director of the Sanitary Commission. States could use their own tax money to support their troops, as Ohio did, under the energetic leadership of Governor David Todd, a war Democrat who won office on a coalition Union Party ticket with Republicans. Ohio acted vigorously. Following the unexpected carnage at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, Ohio sent 3 steamboats to the scene as floating hospitals equipped with doctors, nurses, and medical supplies. The state fleet expanded to 11 hospital ships, and the state set up 12 local offices in main transportation nodes to help Ohio soldiers moving back and forth. The Christian Commission comprised 6,000 volunteers who aided chaplains in many ways. For example, its agents distributed Bibles, delivered sermons, helped with sending letters home, taught men to read and write, and set up camp libraries. The Army learned many lessons and modernized its procedures. Medical science, especially surgery, made many advances. In the long run, the wartime experiences of the numerous Union commissions modernized public welfare, and set the stage for large-scale community philanthropy in America based on fundraising campaigns and private donations. Additionally, women gained new public roles. For example, Mary Livermore, the manager of the Chicago branch of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, used her newfound organizational skills to mobilize support for women's suffrage after the war. She argued that women needed more education and job opportunities to help them fulfill the role of serving others. The Sanitary Commission collected enormous amounts of statistical data, and opened up the problems of storing information for fast access and mechanically searching for data patterns. The pioneer was John Shaw Billings, a senior surgeon in the war. Billings built 2 of the world's most important libraries, Library of the Surgeon General's Office and the New York Public Library. He also figured out how to mechanically analyze data by turning it into numbers and punching onto the computer punch card as developed by his student Herman Hollerith. Hollerith's company became International Business Machines in 1911. Prisoners of war. Both sides operated prison camps. They handled about 400,000 captives, but many other prisoners were quickly released and never sent to camps. The Record and Pension Office in 1901 counted 211,000 Northerners who were captured. In 1861–63, most were immediately paroled. After the parole exchange system broke down in 1863, about 195,000 went to Confederate prison camps. Some tried to escape, but few succeeded. By contrast, 464,000 Confederates were captured and 215,000 imprisoned. Over 30,000 Union and nearly 26,000 Confederate prisoners died in captivity. Just over 12% of the captives in northern prisons died, compared to 15.5% for southern prisons. Draft rights. Discontent with the 1863 draft law led to riots in several cities and in rural areas as well. By far the most important were the New York City draft riots of July 13 to July 16, 1863. Irish Catholic and other workers fought police, militia and regular army units until the army used artillery to sweep the streets. Initially focused on the draft, the protests quickly expanded into violent attacks on blacks in New York City, with many killed on the streets. Small-scale riots broke out in ethnic German and Irish districts, and in areas along the Ohio River with many Copperheads. Holmes County, Ohio was an isolated parochial area dominated by Pennsylvania Dutch and some recent German immigrants. It was a Democratic stronghold and few men dared speak out in favor of conscription. Local politicians denounced Lincoln and Congress as despotic, seeing the draft law as a violation of the local autonomy. In June 1863, small-scale disturbances broke out. They ended when the Army sent in armed units.